Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for attending our event today. Just as a quick announcement, the chat function is going to be disabled for this event. However, if you have any questions for Rachel or our moderators, you can use the Q&A function to ask questions and we will get to them at the end of the event. So I'm going to pass it off to Han Hassan. Thank you guys so much for attending and I hope you enjoy.
Okay, great. All right, everyone. Welcome to our third and final Religious Studies Forum for the semester. My name is Han-Sien Liu, and I am an assistant professor of Islamic Studies in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies at Arizona State University. I am very honored to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Rachel Shine, who is currently a postdoctoral research fellow in the humanities at NYU Abu Dhabi. Dr. Shine obtained her PhD in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. Before NYU Abu Dhabi, she served as a postdoctoral associate and instructor of Arabic literature and culture at the University of Colorado Boulder. Her current book project explores the origins, literary functions, and social histories of Black protagonists in Arabic popular literature. Her scholarly works have appeared in various journals, among which are the Journal of Arabic Literature and al-Usul al-Wusta, the Journal of Middle East Medievalists. And her talk today is titled Arabic-Islamic Epic in Reading Medieval Race. Now, our respondent for today is my esteemed colleague, Dr. Hannah Barker, who is an assistant professor of history here at ASU. Dr. Barker's research centers on connections between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea in the late medieval period, especially the trade in slaves during the 13th through the 15th centuries. Her first book, titled That Most Precious Merchandise, The Mediterranean Trade in Black Sea Slaves, 1260 to 1500, was awarded the Paul E. Lovejoy Prize by the Journal of Global Slavery in 2020 and the ASU Institute for Humanities Research Book Prize in 2021. So without further ado, I will now pass the mic to Dr. Shine and Dr. Barker, please.
Hi, thank you, Han-Sien, for that very generous introduction, and thank you all for having me, especially Hannah and the other Rachel who ran all of the tech and logistics for this. I'm just going to very quickly share my screen. Okay. So before diving into the topic of reading race in the particular body of sources that I focus on most closely, I wanted to set us up by explaining how I think about race more generally in my research and teaching. So first, because race is something that we continuously construct, I follow the philosopher Adam Hochman in talking about race and racialization side by side. Identifying processes of racialization rather than just categories of race is also important because it helps us understand race in languages where a single word for it doesn't really exist, like in classical Arabic. In Arabic, a concept that is productively thinkable alongside our concepts of race emerges from multiple terms that create a field of meaning. This field of meaning echoes in important ways with how we think of race today. Each of the terms on the slide invoke the idea of biological and cultural inheritance described through one's place and one's people of origin. So for example, you have terms like your type or jins, your origins, uruq or usul, and as I see most often, terms indicating your line from those origins, which is to say your nasl or even more commonly your nasab. Popular literature and adab, or elite mannered literature alike, blended racialized ideas of lineage and place. Across various genres, it was said that the world's peoples all traced their beginnings to one of Noah's three sons, Sam, Yafet, or Ham. And these genealogies were also part of the emerging Arabic science of mapping the known world that really took off under Abbasid imperialization in the 9th and 10th centuries. At that point, they also became combined with Greco-Roman geography and humoral pathology. In this combined model, Noah's descendants, oh, I'm sorry, I have a colleague with me, Bishop, no. Noah's descendants settled the globe's different climate zones, usually divided by latitude, as you can see in the schematic map on the slide. Each zone differently affects the body's constitution, and therefore one's external look, as well as one's interior qualities like intellect. As generations progressed, with Sam's descendants inhabiting the world's temperate Mediterranean zones, Japhets in the world's north and Ham's in the world's south, these differences of local nature that were produced by the climate solidified the brothers' descendants as different human types. Ham specifically also has a unique and widely circulated backstory in which he was supposedly cursed by his father with blackness and enslavement. And in the case of Ham's progeny, a particular racial geographic formation developed called the lands of the blacks, or Bilad Sudan, which connotes in some cases the entire world south, and in others just the Sahel and sub-Saharan Africa and neighboring Indian Ocean islands. At the same time that these geographical and ethnological innovations were being made, nasab, one's lineage, was also gradually changing meaning in Islamic contexts. It became the term of use to describe these broad, global, and distantly Noahic lineages, and importantly, it also paternalized. Where in the pre-Islamic period, people who had a mix of male Arabian and female non-Arabian parentage were dubbed hajins, an often derogatory term that's typically translated as half-breed that suggests nonetheless that matrilineal mattered. In the Islamic era, nasab came to mean one's lineage through one's father, and hajin identities concomitantly gradually disappear. Elizabeth Urban notes the importance of this maneuver for sustaining caliphal legitimacy despite the increased use of foreign concubinage, because it enabled political leaders to keep claiming full Arabness. They did this by drawing on sacred history, from stories of Hagar to Muhammad's wife Maria the Copt. However, as the Abbasid era fixation on figures like the Aghribat al-Arab, who were pre-Islamic poets with Arab fathers and Abyssinian mothers who were raised as Black and therefore became known as Black Crows, Aghribat themselves, attests, there was an awareness of and an interest in the fact that some people could still be raised differently from how their nasabs appeared on paper. This was particularly true for people who were perceived as Black, which in turn became tied in some cases to things like low-ranking slave ancestry and late conversion. Those who were in this situation, like the Aghribat, because of their matrilineal ties, but had Arab fathers, technically had a claim on full Arabness, not unlike the caliphs, who so often made apologetic use of this institution early on. People like them, though, fall instead into a racial loophole, and I'll explain what that means in a few moments. The inverse of the conditions that produce figures like the Aghribat, namely relations between Arabian women and foreign men, seem to have been rare and militated against before Islam and continued to be so after. Many legal schools placed premiums on protecting a woman from harm or darar through parity of her spouse in things like freedom, wealth, religion, and lineage. Many children from such relations were regarded as bastards. Now, to quote Josep Lluís Mateo Dieste, the idea of mixture and the production of mixed people are phenomena of a political nature rather than mere descriptors of biological facts. And to paraphrase Jennifer DeVere Brody, the concept of mixture presumes and reifies the possibility of purity. As increasingly those at the upper echelons of power in the Arab Muslim world were mixed, according to prior hermeneutics, the goalposts of what Elizabeth Urban has called full Arabness moved through argument, restructuring, and ultimately the naturalization of patrilineal legal ethnicity as socially determinative. Or at least this was the case for the freer, higher classes. As we'll see, of course, different people are subject to different politics. Overall, what these evolutions in the use of nasab show is that race in the medieval Arabic-speaking Muslim world was, as now, what Ron Mallon has called a covert construction. It's something that society makes, but we make race using technical, scientific vocabularies that make our categories sound like they're objective facts. As with many social norms, we hide race's constructedness in plain sight. Because of this, I'm particularly interested in how the highly intertextual and very literate practices of medieval Muslims sketch the boundaries of racial logic, making what Claudia Rankine and Beth Lafreda have called a racial imaginary. And what I want to show you in this presentation is how a racial imaginary is formed and used in Arabic popular literature, and especially popular epics or siyar sha'abiyya. These works were made by and for the masses, and therefore were not regarded as adab, that elite or mannered category of literature, or as dispensing, professionalizing, or ennobling knowledge. But they nonetheless use race in ways that educate. In particular, they use Black characters to write Islamic history and to imagine the Muslim community's future. However, they do not always fashion these characters in ways that we might expect. They do so in ways that can help redefine how race and racialization operate in worlds prior to or elsewhere from our own. In order to illustrate this, I'm going to tell you about an instance in an Arabic epic in which, for one Black hero, the legal meanings of nasab and the social meanings of race fail to cohere. This creates what Neda Maghboula has called a racial loophole, in which the way that one is racialized by society differs from the way that they're characterized by civic or state rules. One of the largest corpuses of Arabic popular literature, which arose in the Abbasid period, contains a number of prominent heroes who are raced as Black. This corpus is now referred to as the Siyar Sha'abiyya, though throughout time the texts within it have also been known simply as things like qisas or hikayat, stories. The first word of the phrase, sīra, meaning a life path or a journey, goes back to early traditions of writing the biography of Muhammad and his religio-political achievements. If one simply says the sīra, in typical parlance, that of course refers to Sīrat an-Nabi, or traditional biographies of the Prophet. Over time, though, this term also became a genre marker, indicating the cycles of heroes typical to the epic tradition, who likewise earned their legendary legacies through piously minded conquest. The second term, sha'abiyya, means popular, and it relates to these works' grassroots circulation. Unlike prestige epics from throughout West and Central Asia, think for example the Shahnameh, popular epics are composed in semi-colloquial registers of language, anonymously and outside of patronage structures. Under the general efflorescence of popular forms in the Mamluk era, many of the sīras also got written down for mass production, some seemingly for the first time. Heroes raised as Black in these texts come in one of two forms. Some, like Antar of Sīrat Antar, have mixed Arab and sub-Saharan African ancestry. Antar was born to an enslaved Abyssinian mother and a father from the Arabian tribe of Arabs. Because he was born a Hajin in the pre-Islamic period, a central feature of the early volumes of his epic becomes Antar's contest to earn a claim on his father's nasab, and then to prove that claim to his tribe. And because of the fact that his parents were from two different Noahic lineages, at times the conflict in his text, as in other sīras with similarly hybrid heroes like Saif ibn di Yazan, are articulated as primordial tensions between the peoples of Ham and the peoples of Sam. Other heroes, though, like al-Wahhāb of Sīrat al-Himma, who's born with Black skin to two Arab parents due to a medical anomaly, and Abu Zayd al-Hilali of Sīrat Bani Hilal, who's born with Black skin to two Arab parents due basically to a miracle, are raised differently from the rest of their families. They're perceived by others in the narrative to have sub-Saharan African heritage and all the stigmas and associations that accompany it, despite this not really being so. In my current book project, I'm focused mainly on al-Wahhāb and his epic, Sīrat al-Amīra, Dhāt al-Himma, also known as Sīrat al-Mujahideen. I'm sorry, I keep looking at my dog. Sīrat al-Mujahideen means the tale of the pious warriors. It is the longest epic in the Arabic language, with modern editions coming to approximately 6,500 pages. It is also the only epic named for a woman, al-Wahhāb's mother, the military general Fatima. To be sure, Arabic epic worlds are populated by women, most prominently as military personas. The Sīra narrative follows the tribe of Kilab, a North Arabian tribe that was instrumental to the conquest of the Levant as they fight against Byzantines in Anatolia and the wiles of a crypto-Christian Qadi, or judge, named Uqba. Because of this backstory, Claudia Ott traces the text's likely origins to the 11th or early 12th century and the end of Mirdāsid rule in Syria, because the Mirdāsids ascribed their origins to the tribe of Kilab. The epic central conflict swells well beyond Arabia's and Anatolia's borders, though, and takes the heroes to places like East Africa, and the Muslim army collects people as it goes. al-Wahhāb is therefore just one of a legion of people raised as Black who contributed to the Arab Muslim success throughout the work, and often he's their chief organizer and commander. The significance of the tribe of Kilab's Black warriors to the narrative is embodied in Sīrat al-Himma's extended titles, which most epics have, and which are written in ornamental strings of rhyming clauses, or sajah. It's very artful. One manuscript advertises the drama of the central heroes and villains in the text as follows. This is the tale of the pious warriors, champions of the oneness of God, al-Dalhama and al-Battal, the Prince al-Wahhāb, the tribe of Kilab, and the noble Blacks, as-Sudan al-Anjab, and what transpired between them and Uqba, the slippery, al-Murtab, and Shumdaris, the deceiver, al-Kazab, in full. By rendering Black people a central part of Islam's expansion as fierce warriors, loyal dependents, frontier pagans, and even the children of Arab heroes and heroines, Arabic epics offer what I call an aspirational history of Islam, in which racialized others are always already being incorporated into the ummah in narrative and are therefore incorporable in life. In addition, they guide audiences through structures of assimilation, structures like military enslavement, marriage, concubinage, and clientage that are useful for managing and bearing that community forward in legitimate ways. This guidance can also operate in the negative, showing audiences how to police social difference. And that's where the birth story of al-Wahhāb and the racial loophole that it sets up comes in. The birth story of Sīrat al-Amīra, Dhāt al-Himma's central hero, al-Wahhāb, offers the lengthiest and most theoretically dense account of non-hereditary Black birth to appear in the literature of the siyars, and arguably, as far as I've been able to find, in medieval Arabic literature in general. Oh, sorry, one moment. When al-Wahhāb is born black-skinned, to the shock and dismay of all, his mother Fatima is almost immediately accused of committing adultery with a slave. This is a stock feature, of course, not only of the siyars, but of numerous Arabic genres, and perhaps most infamously of the 1001 Nights. Quickly, aspersions swirl around Fatima's black milk sibling and squire Marzuq, which, if true, would render Fatima guilty of incest as well as an extramarital affair, because milk siblings are siblings. After a bout of local litigation concerning who his father might be, Fatima's Kilabi tribesmen go to Mecca with her and her son in tow. Once there, a fictionalized representation of the 6th Shi'i Imam, Jafar as-Sadiq, whose authority is respected and trusted across confessional groups, pronounces a final verdict. al-Wahhāb is Black because he was conceived at the time of his mother's menses, of which his father, al-Harith, was heedless in his lust. Now, the only other time that I know of something like this happening in an Arabic epic, it's in Sīrat Antar, and with a villain, the child of a so-called Abd Hubal, whose name gestures to pre-Islamic pantheistic worship. Hubal was the name of a deity. Of the exchange between him and the child's mother after parturition, it says, when Abd Hubal saw the child, he said, "How on earth is this boy black like this when we're white?" The queen explained his appearance to him, saying she had been menstruating at the time that he took advantage of her, and the blackness was from menstruation, and otherwise he resembled his father in form. Indeed, he was greater than his father in shape and features. Evidence from various manuscripts and print versions of Sīrat al-Himma also suggests that the myth of having a Black child if conceived during the menses was possibly a widespread, if largely unwritten tradition. A late 1800s Judeo-Arabic version, printed in Tunisia, writes an explanation of al-Wahhāb's appearance. There's a truthful saying that if a man has sexual intercourse with a woman, and at that time her menses is at its height, while the blood is pouring forth and its level is elevated, it is determined that the newborn will come out black, akhal. And if it's at the final stage of the menses, then the little one will come out dark, asmar. This is something in which there is no doubt, Hazashi ma fi shak. A manuscript of Sīrat al-Himma from the 17th century, housed in the Bibliothèque Nationale, refers to Jafar offering a few other equally truthful possibilities for what can transpire for menstrual sex. It says, if a man has sex with his wife while she's menstruating, the child will be either black or mentally or deficient, naqis, or mentally ill, ma'tuh, because of the corruption of the menstrual blood. Several other versions of the text cite the difference, pertinent to regulations around sexual intercourse in Islamic law, between the menses and metrorrhagia, or spotting, also called istihada in Arabic, as well as the difference between the different colors of blood at different days or ranges of days of the menses, saying that the child will be black to a greater or lesser extent depending on what stage of the menstrual cycle his mother is in. But where might these beliefs come from in the first place? And why would you ever assign this story to a character who's supposed to be a hero? Moreover, why is this the motivating cause of a hero's racialized blackness when, as I noted before, there were other widely accepted theories about things like climate and lineage that already did analogous work in society? As I'll try to illustrate, the story of al-Wahhāb's conception walks a fine line between a few different moral objectives, namely disciplining sexuality, explicating legal lineage, and adhering ultimately to the Quranic refrain that one's parents' sins cannot be borne by children or by others in general. Thus, there's space that gets made for a hero to arise from all of this bloody mess, pun intended. This refrain of sins not circulating hereditarily also hitches up with a trope that is common to munazarat, or apologias, written to recuperate blackness from its ignoble connotations, many of which also refuted things like the curse of Ham. For instance, Ibn al-Jawzi opens his 12th century treatise, Tanwir al-Ghabash fi Fadl al-Sudan wal-Habash, or illuminating the darkness on the virtues of the Sudanese and Ethiopians by saying, "Praise be to God, who brings the living from the dead, and hence brought the Khalil, or the prophet Abraham, from Azar the blasphemous, and who brings forth the dead from the living, and so too brought Canaan from Noah. Abu Talib worshipped idols while Uthman submitted to Islam, and Abu Jahl went astray while Bilal called the azan," with Bilal, of course, being the famous Abyssinian former slave who was a companion of the Prophet Muhammad. So now, with all this exposition, it's finally story time. The medicalization of Abdul Wahhab's difference from the rest of his family seems to start early on in the narrative, even before he is conceived. It begins instead with the story of how his mother Fatima, who had resisted marriage and then sex with her husband and cousin al-Harith because it would keep her from her heroic life, was ultimately forced to consummate her marriage. And here I need to give you all a content warning because the next slide has a verbal depiction of sexual assault. Al-Harith enlists the services of the text central villain Uqba, the one who before was referred to as slippery or difficult to parse, and who has many diabolical talents with subterfuge, sabotage, and apothecary. So the text reads, "This was the drug that Uqba gave al-Harith, a volatile, overpowering soporific ground up with a blue-hued sulfur. Should a camel taste even a grain of it, it would lose consciousness through Friday. Uqba kept it concealed on his person because he was a lecher consumed with women, and if a lady came to call on him, hoping to hear him speak of piety and righteousness, he would instead drug her and take advantage of her." Once administered, al-Harith approaches Fatima, who at the time is a virgin and who takes her chastity with utmost seriousness. So the text reads, "He undid her trousers, then found drawers beneath them made of well-worked paneled leather with tight-fitting legs sculpted to her form. Al-Harith was bewildered and astonished by how she had safeguarded herself and did not know what to do. He took a knife and gouged out a place in her undergarments as needed and penetrated her until blood poured out. After he finished satisfying his urges, he left her as she was and took off." Though this story discusses Fatima as being left bleeding after her husband assaults her, there is significant ambiguity around what this could mean. Fatima was, after all, a virgin, and throughout history it has been expected, if not demanded, that women will bleed upon becoming sexually active. The violent language of this passage is also unmistakable, even at the fundamental level of the term being used for sex, waqa'a alayha, which can also mean to attack someone. One might infer that al-Harith attacked Fatima to such an extent that he caused her severe physical harm. The audience is held in suspense, and Fatima's menses is alluded to only with the greatest hindsight-sparking subtlety. When Abdul Wahhab is born 9 months later, we are similarly subtly told that though he is Black, like the child of Abd Hubal, he also takes after his father. He is said to be, quote, "like the thick roiling night, dark, taut of limbs, black of eyes, and with beautifully arched brows," with these arched brows being a feature that is a signal mark of Arab beauty that figures verbatim in depictions of Muhammad in Dala'il an-Nubuwah, or indications of prophecy works. Despite these indicators, Fatima's peers recommend killing the boy, thinking to cover up their friend's adultery. But Fatima vigorously rejects this, saying, "Al-Harith drugged me with a bind, addling my right-guided mind, tablet inscribed it came to be, God's judgment unmoving for me. He sent this child I now bear, a starless night of jet black air, and if I don't stave bitter throes, my rage will only overflow. Why breach horizons in sheer woe?" Fatima emphasizes not only that God has granted her this child according to his will, but that she is a woman of superior intellect and morality. Though condensed in my somewhat free translation here, she uses 3 terms across 2 lines of verse to indicate her rational faculties: khawatir, desires or opinions, aql, reason or logic, and madahib, modes of thought, along with the weighty modifier rightly guided, rashid. When deprived of these faculties, she is placed entirely at the mercy of God and her assailant. Here, though, Fatima upholds a narrative of submission to divine will rather than one of victimhood. Fatima's implied passivity in her child's appearance dovetails not only with her notions of createdness, but also with Islamic precepts about who is to blame, or rather who is legally responsible or mukallaf, in instances of menstrual sex, which was typically viewed as a product of male lack of self-control rather than of female desire, because of the assumption, stated also in the Quran, that menstruation causes women pain, or adeh. If discovered, the husband had to pay a light fine for the violation of the law, and the wife was not punished. Not only does Fatima emphasize her lack of responsibility, but she also emphasizes the positive analogs to her son in creation, using terms for the nighttime that are homophonic or nearly so, with black stallions or ghayahib and black thrushes or dujet. She identifies positively with her baby using lofty images from the natural world. When al-Harith and his father discover the child, they noticeably describe him with far less favorable counterweights to these cliches. Instead, they say that Abdul Wahhab's skin is like tar, patren, and that his nose is wide like a cow's snout. True to these distancing characterizations, when al-Harith discovers the child, he immediately rejects the idea that Abdul Wahhab could possibly be his. Instead, he demands that they discover his real paternity. This precipitates a number of legal and extra-legal proceedings, during which what we might call both parents' racial integrity is called into question. Fatima, of course, is accused of adultery, but in one case, a fellow tribesman suggests that al-Harith may be less purely white than he opines, saying, "Do you not see that this child's mother is radiantly white, while his father, though fair, is speckled, ashqar abqa, resulting in his color, a leathery black?" A similar set of intimations comes when al-Harith takes Abdul Wahhab to a group of physiognomists in Mecca, who have the child and the father walk across sand together and then prognosticate from their footprints. And they say, the child is for the marriage bed, al-walad lil-firash. Though thoughts occurred to al-Harith, for the child is black, different in color and blemished in form. By God the Great, this boy is surely al-Harith's son, for the child's eyes are like his eyes, and likewise with his bone structure and other traits. This moment with the physiognomist is strikingly similar to a few different instances in the life and sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. In one, a physiognomist is used to confirm whether his adopted son Zayd is indeed the father of his son Osama due to their dramatic difference in skin color. There, the physiognomist similarly judges from their feet. So it says Aisha, one of Muhammad's wives, may God be pleased with her, relates that the Prophet, peace and blessings upon him, came to me pleased with joy showing upon his face and said, "Did you not see that Mujazziz, the physiognomist, looked previously at Zayd ibn Haritha and Osama ibn Zayd and said they have the same feet?" In the ensuing narration, the physiognomist went in and Osama ibn Zayd and Zayd had a blanket on them covering their heads, but their feet were exposed. During the Jahiliyyah, or the pre-Islamic age, the people of lineage, Nasab, would attack Osama's pedigree because he was deeply dark black while his father Zayd was whiter than cotton. So when the physiognomist said what he said regarding the difference of their color, the Prophet was gladdened by this, for it made them stop mocking him since they believed it. In another instance, Muhammad is met with a couple who has a similar query to Abdul Wahhab's parents because their child was born black. So it says, a man from the Banu Fazara, tribe of Fazara, approached the Prophet, peace and blessings upon him, and said, "My wife gave birth to a black boy." So the Prophet says, "Do you have camels?" The man says, "Yes." Prophet says, "And what are their colors?" He says, "Red." Muhammad replies, "Are there ash-colored ones?" And the guy says, "Sure, there are ash-colored ones too." So Muhammad says, "How did this come about?" And the man replies, "It's possible that it's an interruption of the breed. This final phrase, naz'a literally indicates the extirpation of one's root. But in the context of Arabic understandings of heredity and nasab, it indicates someone inclining towards a more distant generational relation. Theories about the possibility of a resurgence of ancestral traits, sometimes referred to as atavism, date back to Aristotle, who uses the example of a woman who had intercourse with a black person, or in Greek, an Aethiop, and did not bear a black child, but nonetheless later had a black grandchild. When this case is brought to Muhammad, he not only offers a plausible explanation, but he also shores up the importance of an aphorism used by the physiognomists in the Sīrat, which is also taken from Hadith, and states, "The child is for the marriage bed, al-walad lil-firash." This suggests that unless the alternative is really, really provable, fathers must claim the children that their wives have had while in wedlock. In the text intimations that al-Harith might be less than white because of Abdul Wahhab's resurgent blackness, we see a similar logic about atavism and family integrity at work. We see also what Bridget Fielder has called queer racial time, or the queer genealogy of race, in which race does not just flow from parents to children, as is typical in biological epistemologies, but can also flow from children to parents or between partners, pointing to its social constructedness. However, it's ultimately not atavism that's the cause of Abdul Wahhab's appearance, but something else entirely, and something far more taboo. Here we have the more common version of Ja'far's final pronouncement, referencing an imagined prior case that his ancestor Muhammad had seen. So it says, Muhammad said of a man that if he had intercourse with his wife while the blood was black and stopped up at the beginning portion of the menses, this would cause the child to become red-brown or ahmar in color. While if he had intercourse with her at the end of the menses when the blood is pure, the child comes to resemble his father. You, O Harith, had sex with your wife while there clung to her whatever adheres to women from their menses. And during metrorrhagia, a woman's blood is red, the menses is black, and the sperm droplet, the nutfa, is white, and a woman's blood is dark colored. The red and white and black and dark colored materials mixed together, and the creator created and arranged him being al-Wahhāb. And so we find that al-Wahhāb is a legitimate child, and his father is compelled to acknowledge him. In light of al-Harith's villainous characterization as a cruel spouse and bigoted father who eventually converts to Christianity and absconds to Byzantium over his hatred of his child, we may read the results of his illicit sexual act, namely a child that's both black and uncannily similar in appearance to himself, as a mechanism for moral refraction. The father who conceived a child while his partner was menstruating, upon meeting that child, is met with a dark mirror. In rejecting his child by claiming that he's a product of sin, in this case of adultery, al-Harith ironically repudiates his own behavior, imbuing the whole narrative with didactic and sexually disciplining force. This is similarly the case with other punishments visited upon children for their parents having menstrual sex that circulated throughout the late antique and medieval Mediterranean. Perhaps the most well-known of these is the theory that menstruant children would be born with leprosy. This is famously the case in the rabbinic midrash or extra-legal commentary, Leviticus Rabbah. Because laws of nideh, or women's ritual purity in Judaism, unlike the laws for menstruants in Islam, require the woman's effective quarantining of herself from her husband during the menses and prevent her from sex, preparing his food, and touching him non-intimately, a child born from menstrual sex being born a leper directly reflects the conditions violated in order to conceive him. Stories abound in both Greek and Old Persian writings that relate menstrual blood to various types of poisoning, and so too in Islamic sources. At-Tabari, for example, relates a narrative stating that the reason that the black stone of the Kaaba turned black, having come white as snow with Adam from the heavenly garden, was because menstruants touched it during their tawaf or circumambulations of the Kaaba in the Jahiliyyah. And though in Islamic law, women cannot perform tawaf during their menses, they can do all of the other obligations of the Hajj pilgrimage. Ibn Kathir relates that the Prophet Abraham built a well for a community in Syria and told them that were a menstruant to ladle from it, it would run dry, indicating the threat to the community posed by purity violations. Islamic discourses also absorbed the leprosy as punishment narrative, but as we saw with the manuscripts that I talked about before, they added further possibilities such as mental and physical disability and, of course, blackness. This could be because of humoral pathological reasoning. Leprosy was produced by an overabundance of black bile, which also causes a host of other maladies, and which is sometimes the substance referenced in stories of Hem when describing the etiology of racialized blackness. It could also be because of the relationship etymologically between the terms for elephantiasis in Arabic, judam or majdum, and those for amputation, ajdam, which is to say situations in which a person is missing some part of themselves. Ibn Abbas, for example, narrates that the 4 types of women who are unfit for marriage are all known as jadma, or mutilated, and includes 2 types of as well as those with pudendal hernias or insanity. However, this list points to another possibility that I find much more plausible for how these punishments for menstrual sex all got linked together. As with the relation of Jewish menstruants to ways of being in the world for lepers, the reason menstrual sex became related to this host of forms of otherness in Arabic narratives may be because of each of these conditions' analogous social consequences. All of them result in forms of legal dependency and the proscription of certain intimacies. They tell the same stories of social fallout. This is visible in numerous legal rulings, as in a verdict ascribed to the jurist Sahnun, which states, if a man wishes to wed his daughter to a madman, one with elephantiasis, a leper, a black man, aswad, or anyone inadequate to her station, man laysa laha bikaf, and the daughter refuses, the ruler should prevent him on the grounds of harm or darar. This is in keeping with the general practices concerning marriage that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, in which partners are insulated from harm by cultivating matches that are equal in certain socially important ways, such as degree of freedom or unfreedom, health, and the prominence of their nasab. The ill, disabled, and unfree, including manumitted slaves or those to be manumitted, typically are dependents and don't have full legal agency. Tellingly, iterations of similar rulings interchange the word black, aswad, and slave, abd, despite the latter's far clearer implications for marital unfitness. This, of course, points to the commonplace conflation between the two. The word abd is still used oftentimes as an insult in the Arabic-speaking world against Black people. Regarding a version of the ruling using the term slave rather than black man attributed to Ash-Shafi'i, al-Mawardi says, A man may not wed his daughter to a slave or one with a mukataba contract or a temporary contract, or one to be manumitted on his owner's death, or anyone with any portion of the obligations of enslavement. For all those conditions in his view are lesser or naqs than the free status of his prospective spouse. So it seems that in addition to al-Harith being met with a child who reflects his malefactions, he's met with one that reflects society's prejudices as well. These are prejudices that Abdul-Wahhab will constantly confront and defy throughout his heroic career. People in the text, and especially the text villains, recurrently assume that he's a bastard or a slave and treat him with derision. So we've arrived at the big why. Why make the heroic figure Abdul-Wahhab Black in the narrative, and why in this way? As I have argued in previous work, though they were often looked at by the lettered elite as frivolous, the sīras are profoundly educational, particularly around questions of male obligation and family law. The birth story of Abdul-Wahhab achieves similarly acculturating goals with ample flair, policing husbandly and fatherly duties by threatening the possibility not just of difference, but of society's response to difference. At the same time, Abdul-Wahhab's uncanny identity as someone who is raced as Black despite his purely Arab nasab forms an ideal racial loophole within the rest of the tale. He becomes the perfect go-between for Islamizing and clientelizing the large portion of Black people that the Muslim armies admit in the text, the so-called Sudan al-Anjab from the epic's long title. Abdul-Wahhab himself feels these affinities. Despite not having a culturally thick background that he shares with other Black characters hailing from parts of East and Sub-Saharan Africa, he shares a racial experience with them. Ultimately, Sīrat Dhāt al-Himma uses the hero's race in a double-edged way. On the one hand, having a Black child clearly both harkens to negative social choices and engenders negative social consequences. But on the other, we see through Abdul-Wahhab that such children could still be fully human, fully Muslim, and fully noble, or najb. They just may not be able to be fully Arab. Thank you. All right, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Okay, so I want to thank Rachel first for this very thought-provoking and interesting presentation, and it raises a number of questions for me, which I'm going to organize under a couple of headings. So racialization and blackness we'll talk about first. Then I want to talk about the history of medicine and claims about gynecological knowledge. And the last thing, I mean, as a historian, I have to bring in changes over time, right? So we'll bring that in at the very end. But at the beginning, I want to say that I don't expect that all of these questions are going to be answerable on the spot. And some of them may not be answerable at all. So I want to raise them here, both to encourage further discussion and also for your consideration as you continue to develop this area of research. There may be things that just need a lot more looking into. Okay, so to start with racialization and blackness. So previous studies of blackness in early Islamic texts have tended not to focus for the most part on popular literature. There's been a lot of discussion about law and about the Quran and Hadith and other religious authoritative texts, poetry, the sort of adab literature that's the more learned and professionalizing, and you talk about professionalizing and ennobling, right? Ethnography, geography, medicine, but these are all kind of learned fields. And then thematically, previous studies of blackness have tended to focus on sometimes sort of the emergence of negative stereotypes associated with blackness and the justifications that are presented for those in the text and the consequences of those stereotypes for the people who have to live with them. And on the other hand, in response to those negative stereotypes, there's been studies of texts in the genre of praise of blackness, which are all very interesting. And there's been discussion about intersectionality between blackness and gender, as you brought up, both in connection with eunuchs and in connection with what happens with the children of Arab men and Black women, especially enslaved Black women. So then there's another angle of intersectionality here that's about blackness and slave status and how do those things overlap and what are the assumptions about them. So in the context of all of this, Rachel, what you're presenting here today, I think is really distinctive and really fascinating. First, because it focuses on popular perspectives, as opposed to the perspectives of the social or the intellectual elite. And so it's very interesting to be able to think about that and look at that. And then also just the tension within a single text between the idea of policing difference and incorporating difference into the community, and how those two things can be going on simultaneously within the same text, in the same context, which is very interesting. I want to talk also about history of medicine and a little bit about physiognomy, and particularly about the significance of blood and menstrual blood, not just in the context of menstrual sex, but menstrual blood more broadly. So when we're talking about physiognomy, I think there's possibly an interesting tension here between the individual complexion and the group complexion. And that's something that you see in physiognomy all the time, right? How much is each person shaped individually as a single body by their humoral balance, and how can that be affected by various factors? And then on the other hand, how much are they shaped by the various groups that they belong to, whether it's racial groupings or gender groupings or age groupings, we could go on and on, right? And in some ways, this is kind of spinning out a physiognomic boundary case that really emphasizes individual humoral balance as opposed to group. And it reminds me, there are these other physiognomic boundary cases that show up more in the intellectual literature about, are there environmental factors, for example, that could cause two white parents to produce a black child? But in this case, it's this menstrual factor that causes two white parents to produce a black child. So there is some kind of playing with boundary cases here, but it has to do with the individual versus the group, which I think is interesting. And you kind of get into that when you start talking about the idea of atavism and the idea that there could be something further back in the lineage that sort of reappears at various places. I think there's more to do with that on the physiognomic side as well as the genealogical side. Then there's this question about the color and the humoral value of menstrual blood. And so we talk in general about blood, and it's one of the four humoral fluids, and we think of it as being red. But then there's this whole question about menstrual blood, which is not necessarily red. And you have Jafar giving his sort of learned explanation, but it's a learned explanation within a popular text, which is very interesting, right? About different colors of menstrual blood. And I think that's something that's worth looking further into. So just generally speaking, when you're looking at the sort of intellectual medical tradition, it talks about menstrual blood as being a product of digestion. So, and a way of sort of purging impurities from the body. So is there a discussion about color? And does what you eat affect the color of menses? That's something I wondered about right away. And then there's also the idea about how fetal development works, and the idea that in order to create an infant body, right, you need both male seed and female seed, but then the growth of the fetus is sustained by menstrual blood, right? What would have been excreted as menses instead goes into the infant's body. So you have food which is digested to become menses, but then instead of menstruation, that could become a new body, right? There's something going on there that I think would be worth pursuing further on the sort of formal traditional medical side, as well as the way people sort of understand it in this popular way. Then it's also really striking to me that in Jafar's explanation, there's this emphasis on the changing color of menstrual blood at different points in the menses. But when you look at the description of al-Harith's assault on Fatima, there's ambiguity about whether the blood is menstrual at all, as opposed to being blood from a wound or blood that's signaling the loss of virginity. Shouldn't those different kinds of blood be different colors? It should be really visually obvious in theory, right? So then one thing I wonder is, does Fatima bleed elsewhere in the story, especially if she's a general and she's fighting, right? Are there any other instances where she's wounded, for example, and there's any discussion of her blood? I think that would be something that would be worth, if there's anything about that, worth looking for. But then we also know that this is a story that's probing inconsistencies in racialization and the idea of the racial loophole and sort of fundamental internal logical conflicts in sort of racial knowledge, right? So if it's that kind of a story, is it also probing inconsistencies about gendered knowledge and about gendered bodies? So we already have a female general, And I don't know much about sort of the scholarly tradition of studying this particular epic, but I'd imagine that there's probably some discussion of that, right, somewhere. But maybe in this particular instance, there's also a probing of men's claims to knowledge about women's bodies, right? Men are claiming all this knowledge about menstrual blood and how it relates to, you know, the color of infant skin. Do they actually know? Especially versus Fatima's knowledge and her emphasis both on her own knowledge and her own rationality on the one hand, and then her sort of clearly articulated decision to accept God's will and accept this child, right? Which is kind of a different way of approaching knowledge about her body and the relationship between her body and this child's body. And then, so there's, do men actually know anything? Although they're claiming to know about this. And then what good is it if that knowledge is not applied by men, right? If men supposedly know about women's bodies, but then you have al-Harith not just committing rape, but also violating all these rules about menstrual sex, which are sinful and are going to have consequences for his children. Like, what's the point of all this medical knowledge about menses if you're just going to ignore it when it comes to an actual woman's body and blood, right? So again, I'm not quite sure where I'm going with all of this, but I think this is something that would be worth thinking about, whether there's sort of a inconsistencies in systems of gender knowledge, as well as inconsistencies in systems of racial knowledge, and they're overlapping in this really interesting way. The other thing I was going to raise is about the power of menstrual blood, right? You talked about how menstrual blood is associated with impurity, and how menstrual sex is associated with conditions that involve legal dependency and social ostracism. And you talked about leprosy, and you talked about mental illness and elephantiasis, and all, that makes sense. There's also, I think, potentially a connection between menstrual blood and magic that might be worth looking into. And my basis for this is coming more from European sources. So I don't know what you would find by looking at sources from the Islamic world, but I think it would be worth checking. What I'm thinking of in particular is there's a set of legal cases from Lucca, medieval Lucca, where there's an enslaved woman who's being treated very badly by her owner. He's beating her and stuff. And so she goes and asks for a magic potion to make him fall in love with her. And this potion involves menses, among other things. And he takes it, and then he dies, and then there's a murder case, and is it a poisoning, and on and on and on. There's a good article about this, which I can talk to you about later and send you. But it just makes me wonder if there's this connection between magic, menses, men being unable to control themselves sexually. There's a set of themes there. And so it would be interesting to see if there are magical formulations in the Islamic world, I guess, that involve menstrual blood, and then what do people use that for? What's supposed to be the power that's associated with it? You might be able to connect that in some way to the miraculous birth of the Black child story. I didn't write down the name of that one. You just made a side reference to it in the talk. Maybe not, maybe that's far enough away from magic that it's not really going to work, but it would be interesting to look into that. Okay, so we've talked about racialization and Blackness. We've talked about medicine. The last thing I wanted to talk a little bit about, or just suggest some ideas possibly, was to talk about change over time. So you mentioned the story seems like it's probably emerging from an 11th or 12th century context, written down though more in the Mamluk era. So then we're talking 13th to 15th century. And then there are these later copies that are going into the 19th century. So one thing I wanted to know is, are there differences? Are there different versions, right? By the time you get to a 19th century printed version, has any of the content changed from what you would have from, I don't know, a 15th century manuscript? And if there are significant differences between the different versions that we have, it would be interesting to look at changes in medical understanding. So changes in ideas about individual versus group complexion, changes in the ideas about menstruation and how it's connected to conception and how it's connected to fetal development. And then also changes in ideas about racialization. I think you pointed out that there's this connection in terms of inequality of marriage, potentially between Blackness and slave status, for example. But that connection can go two ways, right? Is a person who's perceived as Black assumed to be a slave? Is a person who's a slave, identified as a slave, assumed to be Black? I think the idea that a person perceived as Black was assumed to be a slave has a lot of validity for the whole period that we're looking at. But the reverse, the idea that an enslaved person would be assumed to be Black, that's much more true in the 19th century than it is true in the 11th century. So looking at how that set of connections changes over time in different versions of the story might be interesting. And then there's also a question about racialization of Arabness, right? I don't know if you've looked at Peter Webb's Imagining the Arabs, it just came out a year or two ago. But I think in connection with talking about racialization of Blackness, it would be interesting to look at racialization of Arabness. He talks about it more in terms of ethnogenesis, but his focus is really early. And I think by the Mamluk period, you can definitely talk about racialized Arabness. So bringing that element into it as well, I think would be really interesting. So there's a whole bunch of ideas there. Like I said, some of them I think would be easier to respond to in the moment, and other ones might require more consideration. But I really enjoyed your talk. I think this is very interesting, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much. So if I can briefly respond. Oh, sorry, I totally am stepping on Hansian. I'm sorry.
No, yeah, I was going to say, yeah, if you want to go ahead and respond to Hannah's questions, and then after that, I can ask some questions on behalf of the audience.
Yeah. So first of all, it's really funny that you, I'm going to go backwards, I think, because that's just easier. It's really funny that you bring up Peter Webb, because not only do I reference him very heavily in my current project, but we're actually co-giving a talk fairly soon where we're both in our own ways going to address the racialization of Arabness. So
nice.
Awesome. Yeah. I will keep you posted about that.
Yeah, I want to hear about that.
As for change over time, so that's a really interesting, it's interesting that you bring up the idea that someone who is a slave was not always assumed to be Black until fairly late, because there is some contravening evidence in the popular register. One of the things that you often see in the sīras, and this is across manuscripts from different time periods, and also you see this in both Alf Layla and Mi'at Layla, is the fact that sometimes you'll have a character who in one instance is described as an Abd, and then like 40 or 50 pages later, when that character reappears, they're a Black person. And it's sort of like it's not that they were holding that in arrears for you. It's that you were supposed to know that because you were cued by the word slave at the beginning of the sort of characterization and development, right? Mm-hmm. So there is a little bit of that going on in prior periods. I would argue, though, that something that is interesting there in terms of not just change over time, but change by class, is that this is happening more in popular sources than it is happening in mannered sources, which maybe speaks to the fact that, as your work bears out, Black slaves were generally more easily purchasable. They were generally more likely to be the domestics in your household. And that's true from fairly early on in many Central Islamic lands, and certainly in Egypt and Syria, where a lot of these manuscripts of the Sīras and of Alf Layla and Mi'at Layla are coming from. So I think that that might be a big determining factor there. That is sort of an added curlicue in addition to change over time. Mm-hmm. In terms of change over time within Sīrat al-Himma itself, I do have a chapter of my book in which I address not just the two manuscripts, or the one manuscript and one print edition rather, that I gave you guys, but a whole array of different manuscripts and how the birth story of al-Wahhāb changes in those. And honestly, what's worth noting is that it changes very little. Something that you do see is that, sometimes it just says he'll either be Aswad or he'll be Ahmad, or he'll, not. And sometimes you get these additions of things like, or he could have been disabled, or he could have been mentally ill. But really, it's just that list that changes. It's that list. And then there's sometimes some switching around of which stages of the menses results in which color of blood. The reason I think that there is such a narrow set of contours of change going on there is basically because even though we speak of the popular sīras as being oral textual, a lot of that orality was textual from fairly early on. So the earliest attestation we get of Sīrat al-Himma in the 12th century is actually in a guy's autobiography, where he talked about having read Sīrat al-Himma. He says, I read it. So it's already textualized by then, even though we don't have any extant ones that early. And there are also a lot of records by the Mamluk period of people working with textual versions of these to have recitational sittings. So it's not that they're ad-libbing the way that they do often with Sīrat Bani Hilal, which is like a UNESCO oral heritage protected like archive in Egypt, right? Many of the sīras outside of the Bani Hilal tradition and sometimes the Antariya, so sometimes the Ansar tradition, seem to have actually been basically read in this way. A big factor there is obviously the massive, massive length. Like, who's going to remember all of this? And as much as the oral formulaic tradition is a beautiful tradition, I'm not sure it can carry you quite to what Sīrat al-Himma is doing. The other thing worth noting is that there is a hypothesis by, I believe, Giovanni Canova, who is an Italian scholar of the Sīras, and he thinks that there are basically two different stories of Dhāt al-Himma that got fused together. One of them is an Arabian cycle with all of the tribal conflict, and that's more where we were living for this conversation. And one of them is what he calls a Melitenian cycle, which takes place in the borderlands of Anatolia, and that's where a lot of the central conflict with the Byzantines is happening. And you do actually see, or at least so I argue, a significant shift in how Blackness is being treated between those two sort of cores of the tale. And that's also fundamentally mapped onto textual time. So time is racialized in the text. So point being, great comment. Thank you very much. Gynecology and medicine. So the colors of menstrual blood thing resulted in me doing a massive deep dive into the legal tradition in which, and Marion Katz has worked on this beautifully, in which basically there are 3 different colors usually of menstrual blood: yellow, red, and black, quote unquote, scare quotes around all of this because color terms are sort of ambiguous. But one of the things that's important to note is that in legal contexts, blood in general, and of course, therefore also menstrual blood, is not a problem until it leaves the body. It's not impure to just have womb blood inside of you. It's not impure to have, for example, what you said, the uptake of menstrual blood for the purpose of gestation. It's if it leaves your system and messes around with other systems. But this isn't really what's happening in the Sīra, right? There's this idea that when the man's nutfa, when the man's sperm droplet is going into the woman, inside, all these fluids are mixing in a contaminatory way. So there is something definitely interesting and kind of unique going on there. The only close analog that I have found, and ironically enough, it's in a text attributed to Ja'far as-Sadiq in the Nusayri tradition. So it's a wisdom text with some of his sayings written down by some of his students, or at least, that's the attribution, is where Ja'far says something about the difference of being ensouled if you're going to be a believer versus being ensouled if you're going to be a disbeliever. And he says disbelievers are ensouled sooner because they can be tortured in the blood of the womb. So he's making this point about like the womb not being a terribly happy place for certain people. And that seems to be based on like, this squeamishness about like female biology fundamentally. So it's, again, really interesting. And it's something that I've looked into, but I did not look into the magic side of things. And that's fascinating. I really want to. And just going back to your point about racialization and Blackness, yeah, you are absolutely right. There's kind of been a split in the field in general between studies on the one hand of traditional religious texts, let's just call them that, and again, scare quotes around all of those, and whether or not basically Islam is a universalist tradition that is meant to not see race fundamentally. And there are like verses in the Quran that say, we made you with all your tribes and your peoples, or we made you with all of your tongues and your colors and things like that, that people gesture to say, this is what Islam like wants us to do. When people don't do that, that's doing something else. That's doing something that is local or, syncretic or like a holdover from a prior period, so on and so forth. And then you have works that look at the adab tradition and especially the munazarat that I mentioned earlier, things like Ibn al-Jawzi and also, of course, al-Jahid's Fakhr Sudan al-Bidan, which is double-edged. Again, I keep using that phrase, but on the one hand, you have these texts that are vindicating Blackness, which shows that like people were invested in doing so. On the other hand, the fact that they have to vindicate it says something about society, or at least most likely it does. And yeah, by looking at popular sources, I'm basically trying to say that, these epistemologies of race were not somehow like hermetic in their construction by the higher classes, and then the lower classes were just passively absorbing them. David Nierenberg has this amazing line in Communities of Violence where he says, in histories of persecution, we need to stop acting like, the hoi polloi, the peasantry, was just sort of a passive like vector for apprehensions that the upper classes had. And I very much am of a single mind with that. I'm also of a mind that, these sīras, insofar as they are presenting us with these certain unique cases, are also showing that there was a certain amount of, as you said, tension, a certain amount of pushback, and that conversation was happening at all levels of society. So yeah, that's my response. And I'm going to shut up now and wait for other people's questions. Thank you so much for those comments. They were really generative.
Yeah, I would like to keep talking about this, but we should open it up for the Q&A.
Okay, if there are any questions, please type them in the Q&A box and I will post them to the speakers on your behalf. Okay, so maybe while waiting for a question, I have one on my side. So I have a question that's related to what Hannah mentioned at the end about the racialization of Arabness. And I'm thinking, considering that this text was written sometime in the 12th century, right? This was when you have the Turks, the Seljuks coming in, and also this idea of the Islamic world is now so Turk dominated, and to the extent that the Abbasids are really now the only, I mean, maybe one of the very rare and few Arab ruling lineages in the Islamic Middle East. So I'm just wondering, how did these stories kind of interact with these other forms of non-Arabness, say Persianness or Turkishness, and I'm also thinking on about the concept of the Ajam. So yeah, how do these stories kind of interact with these concepts, and if there are any similarities or differences as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll start off by saying Malcolm Lyons, who has done by far the most extensive sort of synoptic summarizing work on the sīras. He's written massive summaries of each one of them, basically, addresses the Turks in a very interesting way. He says, and I've found this to basically be true in my readings of them, the Turks do not come up all that much in the sīras. You would really expect them in Sīrat al-Himma, where the majority of the action is taking place in Malatya, the majority of the action is taking place on the Anatolian frontier. But in that sense, one of the ways that I talk about these texts is that they are very much a product of Abbasid memory, or as Sarah Bowen Savant calls it, like mnemo history. This process of creating a register, which is sort of, yes, it's under the influence of probably the decline of the Abbasids and the rise of the Seljuks, but in preserving that memory, it kind of marginalizes what's going on. That's sort of the crisis that's giving rise to that effectively. I think that the incursion of the Seljuks into power is actually a very big part of why the sīras start to get talked about, but that's purely hypothetical. I haven't borne that out fully. I just have like a little sort of notional hypothesis about it. However, there are lots of other quote unquote ethnic groups that get talked about significantly in the sīras. So for example, in Sīrat al-Himma, another major set of players are Armenians, which makes sense because of where the text is occurring. And the Armenians are often cast as this sort of liminal population that is Islamizable. And when they are Islamized, can become very effective in things like espionage and other things that sort of support Muslim military endeavor. But there is sort of an understanding that Armenian mostly means Christian, but it also means Christian in a fringier way than saying Rumi, and that makes them sort of, pluckable. And I mean, not to say that Byzantines don't convert in the text a lot too, but they convert in different ways. And the other thing I would say is that one of the ways that these texts really saliently interact with these other groups is through the perception of imperial dominion by neighboring actors. So in Sīrat Antar, which takes place in the pre-Islamic era, you see Antar, for example, going to Khosrow Anushirwan and making inroads and alliances with him and impressing him with his warriorship and sort of getting Khosrow on his side. And he goes and does the same thing in Abyssinia with the local leading negos there and things like that. So it's there's an awareness in these texts that other people have other articulations of power. There's even an awareness that I've argued that other people have other racial epistemologies, and that these societies are important interlocking parts of a world system where if you can get it all to hold together, then you are furthering your sort of text mission, which in Antar's case is a proto-Muslim mission, in Sīrat al-Himma's case is a Muslim mission, so on and so forth. So that's a really good question. Thank you.
It's fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll
ask a question too, since we're waiting for more to come in. I'm just curious,
Sure.
have you ever looked at the Digenes Acrides epic, which, I mean, just because it's the same time, it's also sort of the Byzantine border context, but a Byzantine epic rather than I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, so that's a really good question, because it actually brings us back to like the OG version of Sīrat, the Dhāt al-Himma studies, in which like a lot of early readers of Dhāt al-Himma, by dint of the fact that many Arabists were classicists, looked at Dhāt al-Himma and looked at the Digenes Acritas or Digenes Acritas, I'm sorry, I can't say Greek words, and said, I wonder if one of these is the seed text for the other, or I wonder if these are sort of co-texts. That hypothesis has fallen a little, but it is still a very interesting thing to think about insofar as the figure of the hybrid hero, which I argued for all of you guys is a figure who is hybridized in the sense that he consists of these two, seemingly mutually distinct purities, right? He's on the one hand totally racialized as Black, and on the other hand, he has a totally Arab nesab. And so, like, how do we make sense of that? Is a consistent figure, although hybridity's meanings change transnationally when it comes to the categories of epic and romance. Digenes, of course, means the person of two genealogies. So the hero in the Digenes Acritas, as I understand it, is supposed to be half Saracen and half Byzantine. Saracen. And you see this similarly with other medieval romances, like the medieval German romance of Parzival, where the child is actually born not just half Black, half white, because it's a Moor and a European woman, but is actually born piebald. So it's not that he's just Black and white. In the words of Geraldine Heng, I think, he is an ill-mixed version of this. The parts aren't cohering properly, and this says something about his character in the story. And you see this also a little bit in different versions of Sīrat Bani Hilal. That's the guy who has the sort of miraculous birth that I told you guys about, or alluded to anyway. In a southern Tunisian version of Sīrat Bani Hilal, the epic hero, when he is born, also is piebald. He has a white blaze on his chest, and then the rest of his body is Black. So these different ideas of hybridity also point to the non-standardization of this thinking within the Arabic-speaking world in really interesting ways. And these are changes across time, as Hannah mentioned, and also across space. Yeah.
And genre.
And genre, yes, and genre.
Yeah, it's really,
you can't generalize anything is the moral of the story. So yeah, I don't know if anyone else has burning questions. Or not burning questions. Small questions are okay too.
Any comments?
Comments are great. Yeah, I'm okay with comments. I know there's sort of maligned within conference culture, but I'm fine with comments. Because if not, then we also can let you all go about the rest of your hopefully beautiful Thursdays, and continue to have this conversation amongst ourselves or something.
Yeah. Well, going once. Going thrice.
I just want to say thank you all for coming. Sorry to interrupt you again.
All right, with that said, thank you to Rachel and Hannah so much for this fascinating conversation. Very great topic. It definitely sort of reminds me of what I've tended to overlook in my own research on the history of Islamic political thought, since there's always nasab coming up in sort of requirements for the caliph, for instance. So definitely something to think about in the future. So thank you all for coming. And I'm just going to end the meeting. Thank you all, and have a great Thursday. Have a great weekend. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.